The Bastion was a marvel of human engineering, a testament to their unyielding will to survive. It orbited a dying star, hidden away in the farthest reaches of the galaxy, its darkened surface a stark contrast to the ever-bright lights of the station within. Humanity's once great civilization was now reduced to a handful of colonies, scattered across the stars, their history erased from the memory of a universe that seemed to have long since given up on them. Inside the Bastion's command center, Commander Aria Holt stood in front of a massive holographic map, her sharp eyes scanning the slowly encroaching fleet of the Zalthari. Their ships, immense and terrifying, loomed on the edges of the map, approaching with a terrifying inevitability. The enemy's strength was overwhelming, armadas of organic warships, whose very hulls seemed to pulse with an eerie, malevolent energy. The Zalthari had already obliterated every human colony they could find, leaving only whispers of humanity in their wake. Earth, their birthplace, had long since fallen, reduced to an uninhabitable ruin, the last embers of their homeworld snuffed out in a brutal campaign that left nothing behind but ash. And yet, despite the odds, the Bastion had endured. Aria had led countless battles, each one more desperate than the last, and every time, humanity's spark had been snuffed out only to flare back to life, like a dying ember refusing to surrender to the winds of fate. She knew this might be the final one, the battle that would decide everything. "Commander," came the voice of Dr. Elias Juno, cutting through the hum of activity in the control room. His tall figure appeared in the doorway, his white lab coat stained with the grease and grime of his lab, a place he hadn't left in days. "The Sinosphere is ready for activation. If we're going to use it, now's the time." Aria turned to face him, her expression unreadable. The Sinosphere was their only hope, a relic from humanity's forgotten past, salvaged from a deep space mission that had long since been abandoned. The device, a complex sphere of alien metal and ancient technology, was capable of harnessing the energy of a collapsing star. In theory, it could either obliterate the Zalthari fleet or allow the Bastion to escape, if they could unlock its true potential. But no one truly knew what the Sinosphere would do. Its purpose, its limits, were mysteries even to Dr. Juno. "And if it doesn't work, Elias, if it fails?" she asked, her voice tight with the weight of command. "We have no other choice," Dr. Juno replied, his gaze never leaving the hum of the data flowing across the control panels. "If we don't act now, the Zalthari will be on us before we can even make a move. The Sinosphere is our last shot." Aria nodded, stepping away from the map, her mind racing. She had fought tooth and nail to keep humanity's last stronghold intact, to give them something to fight for. But the price of survival had been steep, and this final gambit might cost them everything. As she walked toward the control console, her thoughts briefly turned to the people who lived within the Bastion. Children, civilians, soldiers, all of them placed their trust in her, in the hope that they would survive. The cynicism of war had not dulled her determination, but now, with the Zalthari closing in, the responsibility felt heavier than ever before. "Activate the Sinosphere," she ordered, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. We fight for Earth, for everyone we've lost." The power surged, the lights flickering momentarily as the ancient device hummed to life. As the holographic projections on the walls flickered and blurred, Aria couldn't help but feel a chill of something more than dread. It wasn't just the weight of the battle that made her heart race. Something in the air had shifted, as if the stars themselves were watching, waiting. And then, just as the Sinosphere's glow intensified, a voice echoed through the station's comm system, a voice Aria recognized all too well. "We are coming, Commander Holt. We will take what remains of your species, and leave nothing but ashes." The Zalthari were here, and humanity's last light was about to shine, brighter and hotter than ever before. The eerie hum of the Bastion's engines reverberated through the steel walls, the constant reminder of the precariousness of their situation. Outside, the Zalthari fleet closed in, its ships a terrifying symphony of jagged edges and organic, living metal that pulsed with dark energy. Inside, the crew scrambled to prepare, fighting against the overwhelming odds in their own mounting fear. Arya Holt stood at the heart of the Bastion's command center, her gaze locked on the array of holographic monitors that flickered in time with the pounding of her heartbeat. The Sinosphere hummed with power, its metal surface pulsing with a strange, unearthly glow. The relic had only just been activated, but already she could feel its energy in the very air, a hum that vibrated beneath her skin, unsettling and primal. Dr. Elias Juno, his eyes wide and frantic, worked feverishly at the main console, his fingers flying over the controls. "The Sinosphere is stabilizing, Commander," he muttered under his breath. "If we can direct its energy in time, it will either repel the Zalthari or it will collapse the star. But we have to focus everything into it." Arya's mind raced. The stakes were too high for half measures. The Zalthari would not give them a second chance. They needed a victory. No, more than that. They needed a miracle. "What's the energy drain?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the unease gnawing at her insides. The Bastion's defenses were being strained to their limits, and she knew that with every passing second, their chances of survival grew slimmer. "The Sinosphere's energy demand is off the charts," Juno replied, his voice tight. "If we push too much, it could rip the fabric of space itself. If that happens, we might not just be fighting the Zalthari. We could end up stranded in a collapsed singularity. We need to be careful." Careful. The word stung in the face of what they were up against. Arya knew their chances of survival were thin, but humanity had always found a way to fight back, no matter the odds. They'd survived Earth's destruction, the loss of their colonies, and the endless pursuit of the Zalthari. Now they would survive this. "Let's not waste time on caution," Arya said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "We push forward. We give everything we have left." A technician near the back of the command room called out, breaking the silence. "Commander, incoming communication. It's from the outer fleet." Arya turned, a sense of dread creeping up her spine. It was too soon for them to have engaged the enemy in full force. She moved toward the communication station, her boots echoing against the cold metal floor. "Put it through," she ordered. The screen flickered to life, revealing the grim face of Admiral Karras, the leader of the Bastion's fleet. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with the same fire that had kept humanity alive for generations. "We've engaged the Zalthari, Commander." Karras's voice was grim, but resolute. "They're overwhelming us with their numbers. Our outer defenses won't hold much longer." Arya clenched her fists, the weight of the words settling heavily in her chest. The Bastion was humanity's last refuge, and its outer defenses were already failing. Time was slipping away. "You need to hold, Admiral," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're activating the Sinosphere now. Give us time to charge it fully." Karras nodded, though the strain was evident in his features. "We'll hold as long as we can, for humanity." The transmission cut off, and Arya turned back to Juno. The Sinosphere was glowing brighter now, its power building in waves. She could feel it, like the deep rumble of thunder before a storm. It was as though the very fabric of the Bastion was bending, ready to snap. "We're ready to fire, Commander," Juno called out, his voice strained but determined. Arya glanced at the view screen, watching as the first wave of Zalthari ships closed in, their immense forms casting shadows over the Bastion. The space between them was growing smaller by the second. "Do it," Arya commanded. In an instant, the Sinosphere's energy pulsed outward, a blinding wave of light that washed over the entire station. The ship's systems whined as the energy surged, the walls of the Bastion vibrating with the force of it. The Zalthari fleet staggered, their ships' hulls warping and distorting as the energy blast hit them, their defenses weakening under the relentless barrage. The momentary victory was fleeting. From the depths of the Zalthari fleet, a massive warship, more imposing than any they had seen before, emerged. It was a living creature of pure terror, its surface an undulating mass of alien flesh and metal, thrumming with dark energy. It was the flagship, and it was heading straight for them. "Brace for impact," Arya shouted as the Bastion's defenses flared to life in a desperate attempt to hold off the new threat. The war had only just begun. The Bastion's entire hull shuddered under the barrage. Sparks flew from the walls as the ship's defense systems struggled to keep pace with the relentless assault. Every pulse of energy from the Zalthari flagship sent tremors through the station, shaking the very foundation of humanity's last stronghold. Arya's hands gripped the control panel before her, knuckles white as the ship's lights flickered ominously. The crew around her moved with the precision born of necessity, but there was a palpable tension in the air, an uncertainty that crept like a shadow in the corners of the room. "Shields at 40%, shouted a voice from the tactical console. "Impact in 30 seconds. Deploy all reserves to the forward shields." Arya barked, trying to maintain control over the flood of information. The countdown was relentless, a ticking clock on the edge of their survival. She knew the Bastion could withstand a fair amount of punishment, but against the full might of the Zalthari flagship, their resources were running thin. As Arya focused on the outer defense, a warning light on the control panel blinked red. "Commander, there's an unauthorized access point in the lower levels," the voice of Chief Engineer Marna Reyes called out. "Someone's overriding the system from within." A cold wave of realization washed over Arya. The sabotage. She had suspected it the moment the Bastion's shields had faltered earlier, but now the truth was undeniable. There was an infiltrator on board, someone working against them from the inside. With the Zalthari pounding on the outer walls, the last thing they needed was someone sabotaging their systems. "Lock down all access points to the lower levels." Now, Arya commanded, turning sharply toward Reyes. "Can you trace the signal?" Reyes' face tightened in frustration. "Not with the main power grid fluctuating like this. It's all over the place. They're masking their tracks." "Can we isolate the intruder?" Arya pressed. Reyes hesitated. "Not without shutting down entire sectors. And even then, the Bastion systems are interconnected. Any disruption could send us into a freefall." Arya took a deep breath, considering their options. The ship's survival was paramount, and she couldn't afford to lose any more resources to a phantom enemy. "Do it. Lock down all access except for the critical systems. We need to contain this before it goes any further." As Reyes worked, Arya turned back to the view screen. The Zalthari flagship loomed closer, its grotesque shape filling the view, a living nightmare made of metal and flesh. It was massive, larger than anything they had ever encountered, a ship built not just to destroy, but to overwhelm with its sheer presence. She couldn't afford to let her focus slip. If the flagship made it through their outer defenses, the Bastion would fall, and humanity's final hope would be lost. But beneath the thrum of the Zalthari assault, another voice echoed through the airwaves, soft, almost imperceptible, but there nonetheless. "Commander Holt," the voice crackled, its tone unsettlingly calm. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Arya's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the voice of any Zalthari warlord. This voice was human. "Who is this?" she demanded, her mind racing. Could it be one of the traitors she had suspected? Had the Zalthari managed to turn someone inside the Bastion to their cause? The response was chilling. "The Cinesphere is more than a weapon, Commander. It's a key to something you'll never understand. The Zalthari aren't your only enemy, and you've just unlocked the door." A burst of static followed, and the communication was abruptly cut off. "Commander?" Reyes shouted, panic in her voice. "The lockdown's been breached. Someone's bypassing our security protocols." Arya's pulse quickened as the truth settled in. The traitor was not just a saboteur. They were orchestrating something far more dangerous. Whoever was behind the breach had more knowledge of the Sinosphere than she had anticipated. They understood its power, its true purpose. "Seal off all access to the Sinosphere," Area ordered. "We need to contain this before it's too late." The countdown to the flagship's impact loomed larger, but now there was something even more insidious creeping through the shadows of the Bastion. Whoever had infiltrated their ranks was playing a far deeper game, and Area had no idea just how far the consequences would stretch. As the Bastion's outer hull groaned under the stress of the assault, Area knew one thing for certain: humanity's fight for survival was no longer just against the Zalthari. There was something more, something hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be unleashed. And it was coming for them all. The Bastion trembled again as another wave of energy from the Zalthari flagship struck, its massive pulse reverberating through the station's core. Area Holt gripped the console tighter, her eyes locked on the flickering screens that tracked the damage. Every second felt like an eternity. The Zalthari flagship had become their immediate threat, but the internal sabotage was a growing concern, a shadow lurking within their ranks. "Commander," Reyes called out, her voice edged with anxiety. "We've managed to isolate the breach in our security, but it's worse than we thought. Someone's tampered with the Sinosphere's containment protocols. If we can't shut it down soon, we risk a full cascade reaction." A chill ran down Area's spine. The Sinosphere was humanity's last hope, the only weapon capable of holding off the Zalthari, but now it seemed as though their own weapon might betray them. The truth was sinking in. The sabotage wasn't just about crippling their defenses. It was an attempt to take control of the one thing that might save them. "Isolate the Sinosphere's core from the main grid," Area ordered, her voice tight with urgency. "We can't let it overload. If someone has activated it remotely, we need to lock them out." Reyes worked quickly, fingers flying over the controls. Area watched her every move, her mind split between the external threat of the Zalthari and the dangerous game unfolding inside her own ship. It was clear now, the traitor, whoever they were, had ties to the Sinosphere's mysterious origins. The question was whether they sought its power for themselves, or if they were being controlled by something far darker. As the crew scrambled to execute her commands, Area's thoughts turned to the conversation she had overheard moments ago. The voice, calm, detached, and human, had called the Sinosphere a key. What did that mean? A key to what? She had always known the Sinosphere was an ancient artifact, one salvaged from a long-lost human expedition that had ventured beyond known space, but to unlock something hidden, that was a possibility she hadn't even considered. A sharp alert from the tactical console jolted her from her thoughts. "Commander, the flagship is activating its secondary weapons. They're preparing for a direct assault on the Bastion's core." The Bastion's shields were already straining under the pressure of the initial barrage. A direct hit to the core would be catastrophic, potentially rupturing the station's gravely weakened systems and leaving humanity vulnerable to complete annihilation. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," Area barked. "Activate secondary defense grids. Juno, bring the Sinosphere online now, full power, everything we have." But before Juno could respond, another voice, this time from Lieutenant Terra, one of their senior navigators, crackled through the comms. "Commander, we've got incoming," she shouted. "It's not just the flagship. There are smaller Zalthari vessels weaving through the main assault. They're boarding the station." A collective gasp rippled through the control room. The Zalthari had already found a way to breach their outer defenses, and now they were inside. The battle for survival wasn't just in space anymore. It was in every hallway, every chamber of the Bastion. Area's pulse quickened. "Lock down all critical areas. Seal off the docking bays and lower levels. Activate the station-wide defense systems. We need to repel them before they can reach the Sinosphere." The Bastion's internal alarms blared as her orders were carried out. Every door, every corridor, Every passage in the station was sealed off with a fortified wall of steel. The only way to survive now was to outlast the Zalthari within their very home. Yet even as the defenses closed, Arya could feel a growing sense of dread. The Zalthari had never just invaded, they'd infiltrated, probed for weaknesses. And now it seemed they had something more terrifying in mind than mere conquest. The voice she'd heard earlier echoed once more, this time amplified through the Bastion's comm system. "You still don't understand, Commander. The Zalthari are not the true enemy. You've unlocked the door, and now there's no turning back. The key has been turned." The words sent a cold shiver through Arya's spine. The Sinosphere wasn't just a weapon, it was a conduit, a gateway. But to what? Suddenly, everything seemed to slow. The hum of the Bastion's engines dimmed. The power flickered. Arya's thoughts raced as she connected the dots. Whoever had infiltrated the station, whoever was manipulating the Sinosphere, had planned for this moment all along. The Zalthari were but pawns in a far more dangerous game. "Juno, stop the Sinosphere from feeding into the grid," Arya shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. "We have to shut it down before it's too late." But there was no response. Turning to face the screen where Juno's terminal had been, Arya's heart sank. Dr. Elias Juno was no longer in his seat. He was gone. And then, with a final, harrowing pulse of energy, the Sinosphere flared to life, brighter than ever before. It was too late. The Bastion shuddered violently as the Sinosphere's power surged through the station, its energy crackling and radiating outward like a pulse from the heart of a dying star. The lights flickered, and the control panels went haywire, their displays flashing erratically as the entire station was thrown into chaos. It felt as though the very foundations of reality were bending, warping beneath the weight of the device's unimaginable energy. Arya's heart pounded as she raced toward the main console, her thoughts a blur of adrenaline and fear. The Sinosphere was no longer a mere weapon, it had become something else entirely. The voice from before had spoken of unlocking the door, and now it was clear that humanity had stepped through it, unwittingly opening a passage to something far darker than they had ever imagined. "Status," she shouted, her voice barely audible above the rising hum of the station's systems in overdrive. "Shields are failing," a technician called out from across the room. "We're losing power to non-critical systems. Containment systems for the Sinosphere are destabilizing," another engineer added, his voice tense. "The grid can't handle this much energy, Commander. If we don't shut it down soon, we risk an irreversible collapse." Arya's mind raced as she turned to the screens, trying to comprehend what was happening. Every meter of the Bastion was now connected to the Sinosphere's energy output, and the flow was increasing rapidly. It wasn't just a weapon anymore. The Sinosphere had become a singularity, consuming everything it touched, and somewhere, buried deep within the core of the Bastion, Dr. Juno had set something in motion, a catalyst for whatever horrors they were now facing. "Commander." Lieutenant Terra's voice cut through the tension. "We've intercepted a transmission. It's from Juno." Arya's blood ran cold as the technician patched the message through. The image that appeared on the screen was distorted, but the unmistakable figure of Dr. Elias Juno came into view, his face gaunt and wild-eyed. His voice was low, almost reverent. "Arya," he whispered, his tone eerily calm, "I knew you wouldn't understand. But now it's too late. The Sinosphere wasn't meant to be a weapon. It's a bridge to something ancient. You've unleashed the very force that the Zalthari feared. And now it will come for us all." His words were interrupted by a low, guttural hum that resonated through the Bastion's hull. The ground beneath Arya's feet seemed to tremble, as though the station itself was being pulled into some unseen void. The voice continued, its distorted edges barely audible over the sound of the thrumming energy. "The Zalthari are just the beginning, Arya. The true enemy is not of this world, or even this galaxy. We've opened a doorway to something far older. The Sinosphere was never meant for us, it was meant for them, and now they're coming. Before Aria could respond, the transmission cut off, the screen flickering to static. A cold silence settled over the command center, broken only by the sound of alarms blaring and the hum of failing systems. Aria's mind was spinning, trying to process what she had just heard. The Zolthari, their longtime enemies, were merely pawns, and the true threat, the one that had been lying in wait for millennia, was now on its way. "Commander," Ray said, her voice taut with urgency, "we've got an incoming signature. It's massive, and it's coming from the same direction Juno pointed to, the edge of the galaxy." Aria's pulse quickened as she turned to face the display. The signature was unmistakable, a colossal, moving entity, larger than any ship they had ever encountered. It was a ship, but not a ship. Its form was fluid, like a living organism made of the same undulating, dark matter that had cloaked the Zolthari warships. It's coming toward us," Aria muttered, a wave of dread washing over her. But the terror was only beginning. As the massive entity drew closer, the Bastion sensors began to detect strange distortions in space-time. Objects around them began to warp, flicker, and fade, as though the very fabric of reality was being unraveled. The station's engines struggled to compensate for the fluctuations in gravity and space, but there was no denying it. Something had broken loose. "Commander," a technician cried, panic in his voice. "The Sinosphere's energy is feeding into it. We're being pulled into something. It's like a black hole." "Shut it down now," Aria barked, her hands flying over the controls. But the Sinosphere was no longer responding to her commands. Whatever had been unleashed was beyond their ability to control. The screen before her warped, flickering in and out, as the station began to drift, helpless in the grip of the invisible force that now held them. A loud, metallic screech echoed from somewhere deep within the Bastion, as though something ancient and monstrous had just broken free. The walls groaned under the strain of the unnatural pull. Aria's eyes widened as the horrifying realization struck her. The Bastion was no longer in control of its own destiny. The very laws of space and time were bending, twisting in ways that defied comprehension. And at the center of it all was the Sinosphere, a key to something that had been waiting patiently for humanity's curiosity to awaken it. And now they would learn just how far-reaching the consequences of their actions truly were. The door had been opened. The darkness was coming, and humanity had no way of closing it. The Bastion shuddered violently as the Sinosphere's power surged through the station, its energy crackling and radiating outward like a pulse from the heart of a dying star. The lights flickered, and the control panels went haywire, their displays flashing erratically as the entire station was thrown into chaos. It felt as though the very foundations of reality were bending, warping beneath the weight of the device's unimaginable energy. Aria's heart pounded as she raced toward the main console, her thoughts a blur of adrenaline and fear. The Sinosphere was no longer a mere weapon. It had become something else entirely. The voice from before had spoken of unlocking the door, and now it was clear that humanity had stepped through it, unwittingly opening a passage to something far darker than they had ever imagined. "Status," she shouted, her voice barely audible above the rising hum of the station's systems in overdrive. "Shields are failing," a technician called out from across the room. "We're losing power to non-critical systems." "Containment systems for the Sinosphere are destabilizing," another engineer added, his voice tense. "The grid can't handle this much energy, Commander. If we don't shut it down soon, we risk an irreversible collapse." Aria's mind raced as she turned to the screens, trying to comprehend what was happening. Every meter of the Bastion was now connected to the Sinosphere's energy output, and the flow was increasing rapidly. It wasn't just a weapon anymore. The Sinosphere had become a singularity, consuming everything it touched, and somewhere, buried deep within the core of the Bastion, Dr. Juno had set something in motion. a catalyst for whatever horrors they were now facing. "Commander." Lieutenant Terra's voice cut through the tension. "We've intercepted a transmission. It's from Juno." Aria's blood ran cold as the technician patched the message through. The image that appeared on the screen was distorted, but the unmistakable figure of Dr. Elias Juno came into view, his face gaunt and wild-eyed. His voice was low, almost reverent. "Aria," he whispered, his tone eerily calm, "I knew you wouldn't understand. But now it's too late. The Sinosphere wasn't meant to be a weapon. It's a bridge to something ancient. You've unleashed the very force that the Zalthari feared. And now it will come for us all." His words were interrupted by a low, guttural hum that resonated through the Bastion's hull. The ground beneath Aria's feet seemed to tremble, as though the station itself was being pulled into some unseen void. The voice continued, its distorted edges barely audible over the sound of the thrumming energy. "The Zalthari are just the beginning area. The true enemy is not of this world, or even this galaxy. We've opened a doorway to something far older. The Sinosphere was never meant for us, it was meant for them, and now they're coming." Before Aria could respond, the transmission cut off, the screen flickering to static. A cold silence settled over the command center, broken only by the sound alarms blaring and the hum of failing systems. Aria's mind was spinning, trying to process what she had just heard. The Zalthari, their longtime enemies, were merely pawns, and the true threat, the one that had been lying in wait for millennia, was now on its way. "Commander," Ray said, her voice taut with urgency, "we've got an incoming signature. It's massive, and it's coming from the same direction Juno pointed to, the edge of the galaxy." Aria's pulse quickened as she turned to face the display. The signature was unmistakable, a colossal, moving entity larger than any ship they had ever encountered. It was a ship, but not a ship. Its form was fluid, like a living organism made of the same undulating, dark matter that had cloaked the Zalthari warships. It's coming toward us," Aria muttered, a wave of dread washing over her. But the terror was only beginning. As the massive entity drew closer, the Bastion sensors began to detect strange distortions in space-time. Objects around them began to warp, flicker, and fade, as though the very fabric of reality was being unraveled. The station's engines struggled to compensate for the fluctuations in gravity and space, but there was no denying it. Something had broken loose. "Commander," a technician cried, panic in his voice. "The Sinosphere's energy is feeding into it. We're being pulled into something. It's like a black hole." "Shut it down now," Aria barked, her hands flying over the controls, but the Sinosphere was no longer responding to her commands. Whatever had been unleashed was beyond their ability to control. The screen before her warped, flickering in and out as the station began to drift, helpless in the grip of the invisible force that now held them. A loud, metallic screech echoed from somewhere deep within the Bastion, as though something ancient and monstrous had just broken free. The walls groaned under the strain of the unnatural pull. Aria's eyes widened as the horrifying realization struck her. The Bastion was no longer in control of its own destiny. The very laws of space and time were bending, twisting in ways that defied comprehension. And at the center of it all was the Sinosphere, a key to something that had been waiting patiently for humanity's curiosity to awaken it. And now they would learn just how far-reaching the consequences of their actions truly were. The door had been opened. The darkness was coming, and humanity had no way of closing it. Aria Holt's eyes snapped open, but all she could see was the void. The blinding light from the Sinosphere's implosion had left her disoriented, her senses struggling to recalibrate. Her body ached from the impact of the blast, and for a moment she thought she might be dead. But the sensation of weightlessness told her she was still alive, at least for now. Slowly, she pushed herself off the cold, metallic surface beneath her, blinking against the darkness that surrounded her. The void stretched out, an endless black sea, and there was no sign of the Bastion, no sign of anything familiar. Just empty space. "Commander?" A voice called, muffled, distant. Aria's breath caught in her chest as she recognized the voice. "Raise." "Here," Aria rasped, forcing herself to focus. Her voice felt strange, weak, like it didn't belong to her. Where are we?" The blackness seemed to shift in response, and before her, a faint flicker of light appeared. Raya's suit, glowing softly in the distance. Aria instinctively pushed herself forward, fighting against the disorientation that clouded her thoughts. A few moments later, Reyes emerged from the darkness, her face pale, eyes wide with shock. She was alive. That was the only certainty in this fractured moment. "Commander, we're nowhere," Rey said, her voice trembling. "The Bastion, it's gone. We're stranded." "Stranded where?" Aria demanded, scanning the infinite void. "What happened to the ship, the entity?" "Gone," Reyes interrupted, her voice cracking. "I don't know how, but after the Sinosphere imploded, everything just vanished. There was no explosion, no debris, just emptiness. But there's something else. I can feel it." Aria felt a chill run through her, not from the cold of space, but from the unease in Reyes' voice. "What do you mean?" Reyes hesitated, her eyes darting nervously to the space around them. "It's like we're not just in a different place. Time doesn't feel right. I don't know how to explain it, but something's off." The feeling in the pit of Aria's stomach deepened. The entity, the one that had come through the Sinosphere, had been part of something far more complex than they had ever realized. They hadn't just been thrown into another location. No, they were somewhere else entirely, a place outside the boundaries of human comprehension. Reyes glanced down at her communication device. "I've been trying to raise the others, but there's nothing. No signal, no response." Aria clenched her fists, frustration gnawing at her insides. The Bastion's crew, the heart of humanity's last defense, where were they? Had they truly been lost, consumed in the explosion that had torn the station apart, or was something else at play? And then, just as she was about to ask another question, it happened. A crackling sound filled the air, followed by a strange hum that resonated deep within Aria's chest. The faint light they had been following began to grow, rippling, warping in a pattern that felt almost alive. Suddenly, the blackness around them began to twist. The stars, if they could even be called that, flickered, pulsating like living things, shifting and bending into shapes that defied any logic. And at the center of it all, a dark rift began to form, an impossibly large tear in the fabric of the universe itself. "Aria," Reyes whispered, her voice barely audible as the rift expanded. This is it, isn't it? This is what they were trying to warn us about. This is the door, the thing that came through." Aria's throat went dry as she stared at the rift. The air around them hummed with energy, an oppressive force that seemed to grow stronger by the second. The voice from the Sinosphere echoed in her mind, its words distant but clear. "The key has been turned. The true enemy is coming." But what was it? What lay beyond the rift? And why was the rift growing wider, pulling them toward it, like some immense, insatiable maw? "We need to get out of here," Aria said, her voice steady despite the terror gnawing at her insides. "We need to find the others and figure out how to stop this before." Before what? Before they were consumed. Before they were dragged into the heart of this incomprehensible force. But the truth was, they didn't have answers. Not yet. Suddenly, a burst of static interrupted her thoughts, and the comm system crackled to life. "Commander, is that you?" The voice was faint, distorted, but unmistakable. "Juno?" Aria breathed. "Juno, where are you?" There was a pause, followed by a strange chuckle that sent a chill down her spine. "I've been waiting for you, Commander. I knew you'd make it here, eventually." Rey's eyes widened as Aria felt her pulse race. Dr. Elias Juno, alive, and somehow reaching them through the rift. But what did he want? Juno, what's going on? What is this place? What have we unleashed? Aria demanded, her voice a mixture of rage and disbelief. Juno's voice, as cold as ever, filled the air. You don't understand, do you? You never did. You've opened the door to something far beyond the Zalthari, beyond your civilization. The war you fought, the battles you won, none of it matters. The real conflict has just begun. Aria clenched her fists, her thoughts whirling. What are you talking about? What is coming? Juno's laughter echoed, hollow and menacing. You'll see soon enough, and when you do, you'll understand why there's no turning back. The connection cut out, and the rift before them continued to grow, its center pulsing with an ominous, impossible energy. The final confrontation was approaching, but the question was no longer how they would fight. It was what they were fighting, and what exactly lay on the other side of that growing abyss. The rift before them expanded with terrifying speed, its jagged edges twisting and warping as if the very fabric of space was being torn apart. The stars that had once seemed so distant now flickered in and out of existence, their forms distorted by the relentless pull of the tear in reality. The hum in the air grew louder, reverberating through the very core of Aria's being, as though the rift itself was a living, breathing entity, one that could sense their presence and hunger for their very existence. What is it, Aria? Ray's voice trembled, barely above a whisper. What's happening? What was Juno talking about? Aria's throat was dry, the weight of their situation pressing on her chest like an invisible hand. Juno's words haunted her. The real conflict has just begun. She didn't have answers, but she knew this much. The rift was not just a tear in space, it was a doorway, and what lay beyond it was not meant to be understood by human minds. The Bastion's explosion, the collapse of everything they knew, it was all part of the design. The Sinosphere had been a key, a trigger, and they had just opened a door to something far worse than anything they could have prepared for. The darkness in the rift seemed to pulse, and Aria felt herself drawn toward it, an irresistible force tugging at her very soul. She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. They couldn't let themselves be consumed by fear, not yet. They needed to think to act. We need to find a way to shut it down, Aria said, her voice tight. The Sinosphere's energy is still feeding it. If we can cut that link, maybe. But before she could finish, the rift flared, sending a shockwave of raw power through the void. Aria felt her body lurch as the fabric of reality seemed to ripple around her, and a scream, deep and alien, echoed from the other side. It was as though the very rift was alive, sentient, aware of their presence. Suddenly, shapes began to form within the rift. They were massive, shifting forms, dark silhouettes that glowed faintly with an eerie, unnatural light. Aria couldn't make sense of them. Their shapes seemed to bend and flow in ways that defied the laws of physics. They were beyond comprehension, more like abstract concepts than physical entities. Their presence was overwhelming, an ancient malevolent force that seemed to stretch out across the vastness of space itself. Aria? Ray's voice faltered as she stared at the unfolding horrors. What are they? What are they? Aria swallowed hard, her eyes wide with fear and awe. The shapes seemed to pulse in time with the rift, as though they were growing stronger with every moment. And then, in a sudden violent surge, one of the figures shot forward, its dark form engulfing the space between them in an instant. The air around them vibrated, and the rift opened wider, the edges now shimmering like the surface of a broken mirror. This is it, Aria whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. This is what Juno meant. We've unleashed something, older than anything we can fathom. The shapes within the rift were now closer, so close that Aria could feel the weight of their presence pressing in on her. The very space around them seemed to bend and contort, like the universe itself was being twisted to accommodate these beings. She could sense their power, their ancient malice, radiating outward, and she knew, without a doubt, that they were not here to communicate. They were here to consume. No, Arya breathed. We won't let them. A sudden surge of defiance burned in her chest. The Bastion was gone, but humanity was still alive, still standing. They couldn't let these creatures take everything they had fought for. They couldn't allow the future of their people to be snuffed out by an ancient darkness that had been waiting in the shadows for millennia. Reyes, we need to get to the escape pods. We need to find the others, and we need to. Before she could finish, the rift expanded once more, and a massive shape emerged. A towering, impossibly vast entity that seemed to fill the entire void, its presence blocking out the stars themselves. Its form was not just dark, but alive, shifting and writhing in ways that made Arya's mind rebel against understanding. It was as if space itself bent and curled around this thing, reshaping itself to accommodate its impossible size. The creature's gaze, or what passed for a gaze, settled on Arya and Reyes, and she felt a cold dread seize her heart. Its eyes were nothing more than two vast, glowing voids that seemed to swallow light. The rift had opened, and now it was here. The war Juno had hinted at, the conflict beyond their comprehension, was not just an abstract concept, it was now their reality. The creature's voice echoed through the void, not as sound, but as a sensation, a presence that filled their minds with a cold, crushing weight. You have awakened the tide, you have opened the way, and now you will see the reckoning. Arya's pulse raced, but even as fear gripped her, a sense of determination flickered in her chest. She could feel the presence of humanity's spirit, the last remnants of the fight that had pushed them this far. They had already lost so much, but they had not lost everything. We will fight, she whispered, more to herself than to Reyes. We'll fight to the last. And as the creature's form loomed larger, filling the entire expanse of the void, Arya knew that the battle for humanity's future had only just begun. The tide was rising, and humanity, whatever it took, would stand against it.